Okay, so now that we are all confused and we all regret trying to learn Greek because of chapter 20, we can move on to chapter 21. And you should not have too much trouble with chapter 21, where we will talk about the imperfect indicative. And this is one of the more common um, cases that you'll see, verb tenses rather, that you'll see in the New Testament. So we have the imperfect uh, kinda in English. So in English, we have one past tense, right? We have present, future, and past. So in our past tense, you can express both the perfective and the imperfective. You could say Ed studied, or you could say Ed was studying. Both of those are in the past. So the Greek has two tenses for those. Right? We have one, we just have past tense. But Greek actually has two tenses to cover what you see on the slide there as the undefined and the continuous, or the perfective and the imperfective. And so the perfective would be the aorist tense, and we're going to talk about it in chapter 22. But that would be I read. And then you have the past imperfective tense, which you would say I was reading. So in the imperfect tense in Greek, it means past and continuous. So it's a linear. So this really matters when you start to do exegesis and you're exegeting a New Testament passage and you come upon the imperfect tense. The imperfect tense is not just something that happened in the past, but it's linear action in the past. I was loving, I was being loved. The way that the imperfect is formed in Greek is we are introducing the augment. The augment is is a grammatical device used in Greek to indicate past time. And the way that the Koine Greek language indicates past time is it adds a morpheme in the form of a vowel sound to the front of the verb. So, for instance, if you are reading along and you see eluan, you should recognize immediately, we talked about this in the last lecture, that lu is the root of that verb. So you know it's a verb, and you should recognize that ending. Then you see that epsilon on the front. That is an augment. When we translate the imperfect tense that has that augment, we typically just add an ed. It's roughly the equivalent of adding the ed. So in English, we would say, I kicked the ball. That is the Greek version of the imperfect tense. And here it is, eluan. So if you want to pause and you want to turn to page or turn to chapter 21 and try to follow along, what you're going to notice really quickly is that I am skipping a significant amount of content in chapter 21. We haven't really focused too much on this master personal ending chart that Mounce puts out, and it may bite us in the future. It may come back to bite us, but there's so much to memorize. I'm trying to really pick and choose the things that I want you to try to memorize, and so if there comes a time when you need to really kind of focus on this master personal ending chart, we will, but I don't think you will. Besides that, there's four sets of endings for verbs in Greek. You've already learned two, and you're about to learn two more, and then you're going to be done with that master verb personal ending chart. So I'm trying to focus on the actual meat and potatoes of the imperfect active. And so if you're following along, you typically will see in my lecture that I follow the book pretty closely. But in this chapter, I've skipped quite a bit of content. And so we're just going to jump right into how to form the imperfect active indicative. So you start with the augment plus the present tense stem, right? You have a connecting vowel, and then you have your active personal endings. So the way that plays out, you see men, eluamen, and that would be the imperfect active indicative. Here is the paradigm for the imperfect active indicative. Now, I want you to know what you're looking at on this chart. Not that you haven't seen a paradigm chart before, but this is an addition to how he lays it out. And there really wasn't enough room on the slide. I'd have to make the text, I thought, too small to add it. But just so that you know what you're looking at, if you'll look at page 227, section 21.7, you'll see what I'm talking about. So what you're looking at here is you're looking at the first, second, third, singular, and first, second, third, plural, imperfect, active, indicative. In the first person singular, you're going to add the augment. And so the augment for this, for the imperfect, active, indicative is all in epsilon for this paradigm that we're looking at. And there's some rules that we'll look at for augments in just a minute, but you can see eluan, s, and amen, ete, on. That should look really familiar to you. The addition that he's added to this paradigm, just so that you can understand how these verbal forms are being created, is if you look across the top. So eluan, that's the form of the imperfect active indicative. I was loosing would be the translation. The omicron is the connecting vowel. The nu is the ending. And the present tense would be luo. If this were nouns, you would say the lexical form. You could still say that, that's fine. But just so that you know, when you look at this paradigm and you see this stuff on the end, you're like, oh, why did he add that? He's just showing you that is the augment, lu is the verbal root, omicron is the connecting vowel, and nu is the actual personal ending. And then, of course, present active indicative, luo would be. So if you were to parse this, if I were to put this on a test or a quiz and say parse eluan, then you would say this is a first person singular, imperfect active indicative. I was loosing from luo because there's a present active indicative form of luo or from lu. So this is the imperfect active indicative. I was loosing. It's that helping verb, were and was, that's going to be key. And then the ing on the English verb. So I was loosing, you were loosing, he was loosing, we were loosing, you were loosing, or y'all, and then they were loosing. So that's the imperfect active indicative. I was. Moving on to the imperfect middle and passive. It's formed the same way. You have your augment, you have your present tense stem, your connecting vowel, and your personal ending. And here is the paradigm for imperfect middle and passive indicative. So you can see I was being loosed. See the difference? So the imperfect active, I was loosing. But in the imperfect middle and passive, the action is being done to you. I was being loosed, you were being loosed, he was being loosed, we were being loosed, you were being loosed, they were being loosed. And you can see the augment, the verbal root, the connecting vowel, and you can see the personal ending across the board. He shows you the connecting vowel and the personal ending to the right there, but it'll be Ilu Amen, Elu, Elu Eto, Elu Amatha, Elu Este, and Elu Anto. Again, these should look really similar to what you've already seen with a few variations. So that is the imperfect active and the imperfect middle and passive indicative. Talking about the augment, there are some rules, and 21.10 lays out the characteristics or the rules when it comes to augments. And there's really three things that you have to consider about the augment, because it's not always an epsilon. In fact, it could be any vowel for the most part. But the rules are, number one, if the verbal root begins with a consonant, in this case we've got lu, then you have an epsilon. So if the verb begins with a consonant, it's going to be an epsilon. If the verb begins with a vowel, then you're going to lengthen the vowel. You're not going to create a diphthong if it begins with a vowel. And we're going to talk about diphthongs in just a second. But if the word begins with a vowel, you're essentially going to just lengthen the vowel. So in this case, agapao becomes agapone. You see the various forms there. So you could say you're dropping the alpha and you're adding the eta, but what you're really doing is you're lengthening that vowel. And then if the verb begins with a diphthong, you're either going to lengthen it or it's going to add in an oda subscript. Again, these rules, excuse me, are in section 21.10. I think the hardest one, really, to recognize is going to be when the verb begins with a diphthong. I think that's going to be the toughest one for you, because I think everything else you're going to be able to, if you say these words out loud, it's going to ring true. So you're going to know that agapao and agapone, you're just going to be able to see it. That gamma and that alpha and that pi is going to give it away, and you're going to say, oh, that's lengthened. It's something you have to remember and look for. It's not as easy as memorizing agapao as a vocabulary word, but I don't think you're going to have too much trouble with that. Certainly don't think you're going to have any trouble with if a verb begins with a consonant and you see that epsilon. That epsilon's you'll be able to see that from the moon. You'll be able to see that really easily in a sentence. But I want you to make sure that you pay attention to page 229, the top of 229, where it shows you what you will get if it's a diphthong. If the original, for instance, is an alpha iota, then it's going to lengthen to an eta with a subscript. An epsilon and an iota, it's going to lengthen to an eta with a subscript. If it's an omicron iota, it's going to lengthen to an omega with a subscript. And then you have a couple of others. You have alpha upsilon that will augment with a diphthong, with eta upsilon, and the same thing with epsilon upsilon. So those are rules that you need to remember, so that if you see a word that begins with an eta and it has the iota subscript, that's going to be a key. So you'll just have to memorize those rules for diphthongs for the imperfect, for the augment. And here you go. This is just showing you how those augments are working. Same thing we just looked at. But memorize those rules at the top of page 229 and you'll be fine. He lays out a couple of parsing hints for us here. And again, you're going to see that I skipped quite a bit. If you go through the chapter, it's not that I don't want you to know that. It's not that I don't think it's relevant information. But when I do the lecture, I really want the lecture to focus on the things that you absolutely need to know to make translations. I think that the stuff in the chapter that I'm skipping is very important for understanding the language, but I think that you can live without some of it. So, what I recommend is that as you go through these chapters, and hopefully you're not just listening to the lecture, hopefully you're going through the textbook, go through all these sections to make sure you're aware of how he's putting the learning together. He's not writing this textbook so that you can just get through Greek and move on with your program and your other courses. He's writing this textbook so that you will learn the language of Greek. But there are some shortcuts that we can take without it really costing you your ability to translate Greek words, which is the most important aspect of this. So that's why I skip some of this stuff. Not that it's not important, but it's secondary sometimes to our end goal of being able to translate Greek sentences and translate the New Testament. The reason I know is because when I learned Greek, I didn't have any of that and we were fine. So I think it's better than what I learned. Certainly, this textbook's the best textbook I've ever seen. But I do think that there's some stuff we can skip. All right, enough about that. So 21.17, he gives us, I think, a really good parsing hint for the imperfect, active and imperfect middle and passive, or any verb, really. So he says, when you see a verbal form, like you recognize, okay, this is a verb, and you can't automatically parse it, start doing some deductive reasoning and start doing some investigating, asking yourself some questions. Okay, I see this verb. Is this a present tense or is it something else? If the endings and everything alert you to the fact that the tense is the same as a present tense stem, then it's probably present. You're probably safe to translate that word in the present. If it's augmented, if you see an augment, it's going to be imperfect. If the stem is different, and this is going to give you a little PTSD from the last chapter, but if the stem is different, then you look to those rules that govern the verb patterns 2.4, 2 to 4, 2, 3, and 4, which we learned in chapter 20. So ask yourself first, is the word that I'm trying to translate or parse, is it a present tense? If it is, then like if it looks like it's present, go ahead and translate it to present. And if it doesn't work, you know that you've done the wrong thing. But nine times out of 10, it's going to be a present stem and a present translation. If you see an augment, then you know it's imperfect. And if it's one of those words where the stem is changed, like some of the forms of lu, then you just look to those rules in chapter 20 to help you make your translation. Another hint or odds and end that he put in here is that if you see, look, this is for exegesis here, for translation, but also for exegesis. If you translate the word elegan, that is the third person singular imperfect. That doesn't carry continuous action. So it would just be he said. That's really just an exegesis help. There are some compound verbs that you need to be some changes to the compound words or verbs rather that you need to know when it comes to the imperfect tense. And I've got the 4 rules for those. You need to go through these rules in your book, starting in section 21.20 through 21.22. And you need to know these rules and memorize them. But remember, a compound verb is a verb that has the verb and a preposition, usually a preposition suffix. So the suffix would come first. So if you have a compound verb, first of all, the augment is going to come after the preposition. So you can see katabino, right? Look what happens. The alpha drops because kat ends with a ends with um, a consonant. It's an epsilon augment, and then you have the form of the imperfect. So just know that the augment is going to come after the preposition. And this is what we just saw. When the preposition ends in a vowel, this is the second rule, that final vowel will drop out before the augment. So you're not creating a diphthong, you're just dropping that last, you're dropping that, the vowel, the last vowel of the preposition. Number three, in a few cases, the final vowel will stay. It'll contract, and then your rules governing contractions will take over. And then lastly, when you augment a compound verb beginning with ek, the kappa changes to an xz. So you can see the example here is ekbalo becomes in the imperfect ex ebalan. Just more rules you have to memorize. Generally speaking, the two rules that you're going to see employed the most are going to be the first two bullet points. Well, the first one is in every case that the augment is going to come after the preposition. But in most cases, I think what you're going to find is you're just going to see that preposition that ends in a vowel. You're going to see the vowel drop, and you're going to see the epsilon or whatever in its place for the imperfect tense. And here is another visual representation of 21.20 through 22. You also have an imperfect of a me. That is on page 233, 21.23. You need to memorize this. That's the only way to get through this because it'd be very difficult. I'm sorry, this is not a me. This is contract verbs. My bad. I'm sorry. A me is next. So these are the imperfect contract verbs that you're learning for this unit. Agapao, which is I love, poieo, which is I make, and pleroo, which is I fill or I completed. And I'm sorry, my phone's going on. And so here are first, second, third singular, first, second, third plural forms. So you have to memorize these paradigms, but it's not going to be too hard. You can see that in these cases, you have, and this is we've seen this already. You see the alpha in agapao. You see it linked into the eta. You see you see the augment, the epsilon augment that's added to poieo, and again the epsilon augment that's added to pleroo. And then you have the imperfect of a me. And here is the imperfect of a me, which is I am, that you have to memorize. I was, you were, he, she, it was, we were, you were, they were. Shouldn't be too difficult because it looks similar to other forms. But you can see it's just that it's that lengthened, that eta, that long sound. That'll be a clue for what you're dealing with. One last thing, when it comes to using a me or translating a me, it's permissible to add the English word there when you're making your translation of a me. And the example that he gives, Estin oikos peritain thalasan. There is a house by the sea, not just is a house by the sea, right? But there is a house by the sea. So adding there helps to make that English translation. So when you see a version of a me and translating it according to, I, you, he, she, or it, or, we, you, they. If that doesn't make sense, you can try adding there. Um, and if it makes sense in English, then that's what you'll do. So you just add there to assist with the English translation. All right. That is the imperfect, both the imperfect um, active and the imperfect middle and passive and imperfect me. Our vocabulary words for this week. Start with those. Akalutho, I follow, I accompany. Didasco, I teach. If you've ever been a teacher and you use the word didactic, that's where it comes from. Didasco, I teach. I have a hard time with this one. Epraotao, I ask for. Erotao, I ask, request. You see those are very similar. Thelo, I wish, I desire, I enjoy. Peripateo, I walk around or I live. Sunagone or sunagoge, I'm sorry. That's a synagogue. Sunagoge. Phariseos, Pharisee. It's pretty easy because it sounds like Pharisee. And chronos, time. Chronographic watch, time. All right, gang. So that is chapter 21. That's imperfect indicative. Great job this semester. Um, and I'll see you soon for chapter 22. Stop sharing. We'll see you soon.